get everything in. First, I want to thank Stefan for inviting me and Kimberly for organizing everything, and all of you for coming, and especially all the other speakers who showed me today that I'm not finished learning from Masao. I was an undergraduate student of Masao's at Berkeley in 1983. It was a life-altering encounter. Just about everything he said to me over the years became something I would think about. I remember at one point, I was standing in the hallway talking to him on the phone, and he said something like, "English professors need to know about economics." And I said, yes, Masao, you're right, yes. And then 10 years later, I published a book about economics. It took me that long to take up the challenge that Masao offered me. Today, I just want to dwell on one moment, one fleeting moment with Masao, and even that will take a few minutes. In September 2002, after having dinner in Torrey Pines, Masao Miyoshi and I were talking, as usual, about the dire state of the university in general and the bleak state of the humanities in particular. Amid all the indignation and ruthless critique, Miyoshi suddenly switched topics and astonished me by saying that he'd been reading a lot of Plato lately. He said he admired Socrates for his bluntness and asked if I'd read a book by Pierre Hadot titled Philosophy as a Way of Life. No, I hadn't, I said, but I scribbled it down and resolved to find it right away. In retrospect, it's clear that Miyoshi was reading Socrates and Hadot at roughly the same time he was proposing, in his essay Turn to the Planet and in other interventions, that our intellectual future, and as Mary Leon pointed out, our future itself, had to be framed in terms of planetarity. As far as I know, there's no explicit trace of Hadot in Miyoshi's writing. And it may well be that he was interested in Hadot mostly in terms of the link between teaching and everyday life, rather than as a key ingredient in his intellectual program. But if the conjuncture of these references was not Miyoshi's concern, it has certainly become mine. If critical theory, or even thinking as such, does not somehow become a way of life, then it is condemned to be useless, a misfortune. In the time I have here, I want to outline a few points where a reading of Hadot, unexpectedly, on ancient philosophy, may intersect with the urgent contemporary tasks proposed in Trespasses. First, I should offer a few remarks about Hadot and his place in the current theoretical scene. He is perhaps best known as the historian of ancient philosophy, whose work was taken up by Foucault, somewhat incorrectly in Hadot's view, in Foucault's final works, The Uses of Pleasure and Care of the Self, the books that Foucault was writing at Berkeley the same years that I was studying with Masao. As more of Hadot's work has been translated, he has somewhat unexpectedly been turned into yet another French theorist, inspiring a reappraisal of both ancient philosophy and contemporary theory that portrays an ongoing conflict between practice and doctrine. It is a mistake, according to Hadot, to read the ancient schools as so many different philosophical systems. They should be understood instead as various ways of life, each offering a distinctive set of spiritual exercises, that's the proper quote, aimed at an ongoing transformation of our vision of the world and a metamorphosis of our personality. This conception of spiritual exercises, encompassing psychic, intellectual, and ethical concerns, all of which it grounds in material practices, has proven to be a very attractive idea to all kinds of people, ranging from anti-theory humanists to post-humanist theorists. For our purposes, it's not a matter of translating Miyoshi into the terms of ancient philosophy, but of recognizing that the critique and program launched by him under the slogan of planetarity will necessarily involve certain kinds of spiritual exercise, even and especially insofar as we need to break from our old ways of thinking and living. For Miyoshi, the question of how to carry out the fundamental changes we need necessarily includes the day-to-day, face-to-face work of teaching and learning. It's a pedagogical or maybe a propagandistic task that's implied by his proposals. So by reading Hadot in light of Miyoshi, what once appeared to be ethical attitudes can now be understood as political positions. Let me reconsider then the 4 kinds of spiritual exercise described by Hadot, but brought into focus by Miyoshi. First, we must learn to live. Of course, this is the first lesson of every ethical teacher or spiritual guide. You may think that you're already living, but you're not really living yet. You must change your life, as the torso of Apollo reminded Rilke. The demand that we must learn to live will always come as a painful blow before it can become an inspiring task. In Trespasses, however, this imperative is not expressed in the usual subjective register. Instead, it is a question of learning that we are alive, which has less to do with individual awakening than with a more disorienting realization that the very idea of life can only be grasped on a planetary scale. Miyoshi calls it a realization of the total commonality. And yet such an insight arrives, if it ever does, not as a vision of some future state, but rather as a shattering glimpse of the situation we've already brought about, the environmental deterioration of the planet as a result of human consumption of natural resources. In other words, planetarity does not designate some higher awareness attained by beautiful souls. It is instead a woeful realization of the bare conditions of life shared by everyone in this world. The question thus becomes, what can we do with this lesson? Second, we must learn to dialogue. Again, it is tempting to hear this demand as an obligation to have good manners, to be deferential to every sign of difference. That is not how Miyoshi understands dialogue. When he said that he admired the bluntness of Socrates, he was praising what the ancient Greeks called parrhesia, frankness or fearless speech, which would include speaking truth to power. Miyoshi always insisted on and demonstrated that the kind of dialogue we need is combative and uncompromising. Dialogue is the medium through which our common bonds are made explicit, precisely by being fought over. He writes, "By far the most difficult task in this project is how to invent a way to persuade, not advertise, culturally as well as politically, that there is no other future for any of us." This is a disabused, defiant kind of dialogue, something that can only be carried out as a collective task. I think that Miyoshi would recognize, as several people have pointed out, the Occupy Wall Street movement as an attempt to generate just this kind of dialogic learning process, carried out in the face of an otherwise deadening and monotone public sphere. Third, we must learn how to die. Hadot lays great stress on the Platonic notion that philosophy is a training for death, and he traces the idea through its Stoic, Epicurean, and skeptical variants. One learns how to die by contemplating the whole, taking up a position that leaves out the cares of mere mortal creatures. Thus, in fact, the study of physics can be approached as one of the most important ancient spiritual exercises, insofar as it forces the individual subject to surrender its privileged position, dissolving into atoms or flowing into the cosmos. In this light, we can recognize Miyoshi's insistence that we all learn about science, as well as his repeated reminders that we might fail in our efforts to reimagine our common and universal culture. We have to put extinction on the agenda, because any pursuit of knowledge nowadays that does not admit that danger is falsified in advance. Such a sentiment is perfectly consistent with a neo-Stoic view that our only ethical task is to be worthy of what happens to us. As Miyoshi says, perhaps we deserve to perish. Like Lucretius, we should pursue this knowledge cheerfully. We should be worthy of it. The program of planetarity, then, will proceed as much under the open threat of death as in the guarded hope for life. Finally, we have to learn how to read. As Hadot puts it, each generation must take up from scratch the task of learning to read and to reread the old truths, to relearn the sense of the world. It is certainly the case that learning to read must keep starting from scratch. That is why we are always able to invest teaching and learning with such revolutionary aspirations. It is a practice without finality. We are obliged to acquire our most basic abilities anew every time, without the confidence that we already know what we need to know, and without the despair that it is already too late. But for Miyoshi, it is not the old truths that need to be reread, but the new untruths, especially the ones that suggest that it is somehow possible to go back or even to stay still. I think this is crucial. You can't go back. This is the fundamental lesson. Reading calls for a reckoning. The act of reading calls for a reckoning. And that breaks the spell of stasis and banishes the allure of nostalgia or regression. That is why this lesson crystallizes all of the others in an absolutely immediate way. Learning to read is what we can do right now, right here, in order for there to be a future. It is a kind of work on ourselves that is not a retreat into solipsism. On the contrary, it is aimed precisely at practicing the courage several people have evoked from the end of literary elaborations. And so it is a practice whereby we not only make ourselves worthy of whatever happens, but we make ourselves ready for the kind of unforeseeable changes that might be capable of changing the planetary situation. Taken together, these 4 lessons help us to see how to carry out the ultimate act of trespassing, to learn how to break into the already doomed future prepared for us, so that we might finally live on this planet as if it belongs to everybody here, as if we ourselves, as if we owe ourselves and each other a good life. How we can fulfill this obligation, though, remains to be seen. Okay, thank you.